The crystal champagne glass shattered against the marble floor just inches from her feet, and in that moment, Maya Johnson didn't flinch. She'd faced harder punches than a spoiled rich man's tantrum. But what made her hands tremble wasn't fear. It was the weight of a dignity she'd been swallowing for 6 months. A pride she'd been choking down with every yes. Sir, and right away, ma'am. And as she looked up at Marcus Blackwell, the arrogant owner of Blackwell's, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, standing there in his $1,000 suit with that smirk that said he owned everything, including her time and self-respect. She felt something ancient and powerful stirring in her chest, something she'd buried the night her daughter got sick and she'd hung up her gloves to pay hospital bills instead of winning championships. Marcus Blackwell had inherited his father's restaurant empire and believed he'd inherited the right to treat people like servants in the worst sense of the word. He'd never been told no, never been challenged, never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. And tonight, when Maya had politely suggested that perhaps the kitchen could prepare his steak differently rather than sending back the third one with insults that made the chef cry, he'd decided to make an example of her in front of the entire Friday night crowd of socialites and celebrities who frequented his establishment. "You think you're tough?" Marcus said, loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice dripping with the kind of contempt that comes from never having struggled for anything. "You've got that look in your eye, like you want to hit me. Here's an idea. Since you're so confident, I heard the staff saying you used to do some kind of boxing or whatever. How about we settle this properly? You and me, in a ring, tomorrow at my private gym. You win, I'll pay you $50,000. And you can walk out of here with your dignity. You lose, you apologize to me on your knees, in front of everyone, and quit." The restaurant went silent, 200 eyes turning to watch this tall, graceful black woman in her simple server's uniform, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, her face showing every one of her 32 years, but still beautiful, still strong, and nobody knew that they were looking at Maya "Mamba" Johnson, who'd gone 23-0 as a professional boxer, before walking away from a title shot to save her daughter's life. Maya's mind flooded with memories, the roar of crowds chanting her name, the feel of gloves connecting, the pure freedom of being the best at something, the scholarship that got her out of the projects, the Olympics that she'd missed by one fight because she'd gotten pregnant, the comeback that had sports writers calling her the future of women's boxing, and then Zara's diagnosis, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and the choice that wasn't really a choice at all, Glory or her baby girl's life. She'd chosen Zara every single time, would choose her 1,000 times more. Had sold her trophies, taken 3 jobs, moved into a 1-bedroom apartment, and never once regretted it. Bet, standing here now, looking at this man who'd never sacrificed anything, never loved anything more than his own reflection. She felt a righteous anger that was different from the fighting spirit she'd known in the ring. This was deeper, older, connected to every woman who'd ever had to smile through disrespect, every person who'd ever been judged by their current circumstances rather than their full story. "Tomorrow, 2 o'clock, Maya heard herself say, her voice steady and calm, "but when I win, you don't just pay me. You work 1 full week as a server in your own restaurant, minimum wage, and you treat every single staff member with the respect they deserve from now on, or I go to every news outlet in this city and tell them exactly what kind of man you really are." Marcus laughed, actually threw his head back and laughed, already imagining his victory, already planning how he'd describe her humiliation to his wealthy friends, and he agreed, shaking her hand with a grip meant to intimidate. But that felt like nothing to someone who'd trained with heavyweight champions. That night, Maya rode the bus home to the small apartment she shared with Zara, now 8 years old and in remission for 2 years. A miracle child with her mother's eyes and her father's smile. He'd been a good man, who'd died in a workplace accident before Zara was born, leaving Maya alone but determined. And when she walked in, her daughter was already asleep, her breathing peaceful and steady. The sound Maya listened for every single night, like a prayer being answered. She sat on the edge of Zara's bed, watching her baby sleep, and thought about what she'd agreed to. She hadn't trained in 2 years, hadn't thrown a real punch since the night she'd beaten Jennifer Martinez, and then walked away from the contract that would have made her rich and famous but required 6 months of training camp away from her sick daughter. And her body wasn't the same machine it had been, softened by long shifts and cheap food and exhaustion that came from working 3 jobs before Zara got better. But Maya Johnson hadn't become a champion by accident. She'd been raised by a grandmother who'd marched with King, who'd taught her that dignity wasn't given, it was taken, protected, defended, and that sometimes you had to stand up not because you'd win, but because kneeling was worse than any defeat. And so at 5 the next morning, after dropping Zara at her friend's house for a Saturday playdate, Maya went to the old gym where she'd trained a lifetime ago. The place that still smelled like sweat and dreams and determination, and where her old coach, Ray, a 70-year-old former Marine who'd seen something special in an angry 15-year-old girl from the projects and turned her into poetry with fists, took one look at her face and said, "I was wondering when you'd come home." For 8 hours, Ray didn't ask questions, just put her through drills, gently at first, then harder as muscle memory took over and Maya's body remembered what her mind had never forgotten: how to move, how to breathe, how to see 3 punches ahead, how to turn defense into offense, how to be water and stone at the same time. More importantly, Ray reminded her why she'd been special. Not because she hit the hardest, but because she fought smart, patient, always thinking, always adapting, turning opponents' strength against them, making arrogance into vulnerability. "This man you're fighting," Ray said, as they cooled down, "he's never really been hit, has he? Never faced real consequences. Men like that? They're all ego and no foundation. You don't need to hurt him, Maya. You just need to show him the truth. And the truth is always humbling." At 1:45 p.m., Maya arrived at Blackwell's private gym, a palace of chrome and mirrors and expensive equipment in the penthouse of his downtown building. And Marcus was there with about 30 of his wealthy friends, men in designer workout clothes and women in luxury all of them treating this like entertainment, like a Roman circus where the poor fought for their amusement. And she felt her grandmother's voice in her head. "Let them underestimate you. Baby, it's a gift they give you for free." Marcus had clearly done some training. He had the build of someone who worked out with expensive personal trainers. Muscles for show, and he'd probably done some boxing classes at boutique gyms where they never actually hit back hard. But Maya could see it in his stance. The way he held his gloves too low, the way his weight was distributed wrong, the way his eyes showed excitement instead of focus. And she knew this would be over quickly if she wanted it to be. But that wasn't the point. The point was the lesson, and lessons had to be taught carefully to stick. They touched gloves, and Marcus came out aggressive, throwing wild punches with power, but no technique, trying to overwhelm her, and Maya slipped and blocked everything easily, not even countering, just letting him tire himself out. And she could see the frustration building in his face as nothing connected, as this woman he'd dismissed as beneath him moved like smoke, untouchable and calm. "Stand still and fight," he shouted. And his friends laughed nervously because they were beginning to realize this wasn't going the way Marcus had promised. And Maya decided it was time. She'd been silent for 6 months, swallowed her pride for 6 months, smiled through disrespect for 6 months, and now she was going to speak in the only language this man might actually understand. She let him throw a particularly wild right hand, stepped inside it, and delivered a perfect 3-punch combination to his body, not hard enough to injure, but hard enough that Marcus's eyes went wide with shock and pain he'd never experienced, the air rushing out of his lungs, his body folding slightly in before he could recover. Maya was already out of range, circling, and she said clearly, "That's for Rosa, your head chef. Who cries in the freezer because you told her she's too old and should retire even though she's supporting 3 grandchildren. Marcus's face went red with humiliation and anger, and he charged forward, and Maya sighed, using his own momentum to off-balance him, tapping him with a perfect right hand to the temple that made his knees wobble again. Controlled, precise, painful, but not damaging, and, she said, that's for Jerome, your doorman, who you docked a week's pay because he let a homeless-looking man in the restaurant that was his brother, coming to tell him their mother died. The gym was absolutely silent now, except for Marcus's heavy breathing and the sound of his feet stumbling on the canvas, and Maya could see his friends looking at each other, uncomfortable, perhaps for the first time seeing their own behavior reflected in someone they knew. And she continued, giving Marcus a boxing lesson that was really a life lesson. Each controlled punch a statement about the people he'd dismissed, the workers he'd degraded, the human beings he'd treated as furniture in his privileged life. That's for Angela, the single mother you cut from full-time to part-time so you wouldn't have to provide health insurance, Maya said, landing a beautiful straight left that snapped Marcus's head back. And that's for Miguel, who asked for 2 days off for his citizenship ceremony, and you told him maybe he should just go back where he came from. And that's for every person who ever had to choose between their dignity and their survival while you played king in your castle built on their backs. Marcus was trying now, really trying, swinging with everything he had. But Maya was untouchable, years of professional training against his months of ego-driven gym sessions, and she could have knocked him out 10 times already, but instead, she was teaching, demonstrating, showing him and everyone watching what it meant to be truly outmatched, to be powerless, to be at someone else's mercy. And she saw the exact moment when the lesson landed, when Marcus's eyes changed from angry to afraid to something else, something that might have been understanding. Maya stopped punching and lowered her gloves, standing in the center of the ring, and she said, I could end this right now. Mr. Blackweye could knock you down in front of all your friends, humiliate you the way you planned to humiliate me, but I'm not going to, because I'm not fighting you to prove I'm better. I'm fighting you to show you that every single person you've looked down on has a story you never bothered to learn, has dignity you never bothered to respect, has value that exists whether you acknowledge it or not. Ty was Maya Mamba Johnson, undefeated professional boxer, Olympic hopeful. Someone Sports Illustrated called the future of the sport, and I gave it all up to save my daughter's life, and I'd do it again without hesitation. And you never knew that because you never saw me as a person, just as someone to serve you, and that's what you do to everyone, and that's why you're really losing right now. Not this fight, but your own humanity. The words hung in the air like a bell that couldn't be unrung. And Marcus stood there, his expensive mouthguard making his breathing sound harsh and labored, his perfect hair messed up, his designer boxing shorts and gloves suddenly looking like a costume. And for the first time in his privileged life, he understood what it meant to be completely, utterly wrong. He pulled out his mouthguard and took off his gloves, his hands shaking not from exhaustion, but from emotion, and, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I didn't know, I'm sorry. And Maya could see tears in his eyes, real ones, the kind that come when your entire understanding of yourself cracks open and you don't like what you see inside. Sorry isn't enough, Maya said firmly. Sorry is just a word change, is what matters. Action is what matters. Treating people with dignity from this moment forward is what matters. Can you do that? Can you actually see the people around you as human beings, with stories and struggles and value? Marcus nodded, and for the first time, his face showed something other than arrogance. It showed humility, genuine and raw and uncomfortable. And he said, I'll work the week as a server. I'll pay you the 50,000, and I'll try to be better. I don't know how, I don't know if I can, but I'll try. Maya stepped forward and offered her glove to tap his, a sign of respect in boxing, and said, "That's all anyone can do. Try, fail, learn. Try again. That's what life is for people like me. People who don't get safety nets and second chances handed to them. And maybe it's time people like you learned that too." Over the next week, something remarkable happened at Blackwell's restaurant. Marcus Blackwell, billionaire heir and owner, worked the floor in a server's uniform, taking orders, carrying trays, dealing with difficult customers, standing for 12-hour shifts, feeling the ache in his feet and back, hearing the casual rudeness and dismissal, experiencing firsthand what his employees dealt with every day, and it broke something in him. Cracked open the shell of privilege he'd lived in his entire life. Maya watched him struggle, saw him bite his tongue when customers were condescending, saw him rush to help other servers when they got overwhelmed, saw him learning names and stories of the kitchen staff and cleaning crew and people he'd walked past for years without seeing. And she saw something else. Two other employees watching him, skeptical at first, then cautiously hopeful, then gradually warming as they realized this wasn't a performance but an actual transformation. On the last day of his week, Marcus called a staff meeting and stood in front of everyone, the servers and chefs, and dishwashers and custodians, and hosts and bartenders, and, he said, "I've been a terrible boss and a worse human being. I've treated you all as if your value was determined by your position rather than your personhood, and I'm sorry, genuinely, deeply sorry, and, starting immediately, everyone is getting a raise to a real living wage, full health insurance, paid family leave, and profit sharing. Because this restaurant succeeds because of you, not because of me. And it's time the rewards reflected that reality, and I need you to hold me accountable, to call me out when I slip back into old behaviors. Because transformation isn't a moment, it's a practice, and I'm going to need help." The staff stood in stunned silence for a moment. Then someone started clapping. It was Rosa, the head chef, and then everyone joined in. Not because Marcus deserved applause, but because they were celebrating their own dignity being recognized, their own worth being acknowledged. And Maya felt tears running down her face, because this was a victory more meaningful than any championship belt. Marcus gave Maya the $50,000 in a private meeting, but he gave her something else too, a proposal. He wanted to fund a boxing gym in her neighborhood, a place where kids could train for free, where they could find purpose and discipline and hope the way Maya once had. And he wanted her to run it, to coach, to pass on what she'd learned, not just about boxing, but about dignity and perseverance and fighting for what matters. "I can't give back the years of being a terrible person," Marcus said, "but I can fund futures for people who deserve better than the world they were born into. Will you help me do that? Will you teach me how to actually make a difference instead of just writing checks to feel better about myself?" Maya thought about Zara, about the world her daughter would grow up in, about the girls and boys in their neighborhood who needed to see possibility instead of just limitation. And she said yes, not because Marcus was redeemed. Redemption was a lifelong journey, not a destination, but because the opportunity to help her community was bigger than her pride. 6 months later, the Maya Johnson Community Boxing Center opened in a renovated warehouse, with professional equipment and experienced coaches and a waiting list of kids eager to learn. And on opening day, Maya stood in the ring with Zara, watching from the front row, her beautiful, healthy daughter who'd beaten cancer and who was growing up learning that strength wasn't just physical, but moral. That fighting wasn't about hurting others, but protecting what mattered. That dignity was something you carried inside regardless of your circumstances. Marcus was there too, working not as a benefactor seeking credit, but as a volunteer, mopping floors and helping set up equipment, still learning, still trying, still practicing the humility that had been beaten into him not by Maya's fists, but by the truth her fists had delivered. As Maya taught her first class of young fighters, boys and girls of all backgrounds, all learning that discipline and respect were as important as technique, she realized that she'd won something more valuable than any title. She'd won the fight for her own dignity. She'd taught a powerful lesson about humanity. And she'd created opportunity for the next generation to rise. And isn't that what champions are really supposed to do? That night, back in their apartment, Zara asked, "Mama, why did you stop boxing before?" "Really?" And Maya pulled her daughter close and said, "Because some fights happen in the ring, baby, and some fights happen in life. And the most important ones are always for love. I fought for you. I fought for our community. I fought for dignity. And those victories matter more than any belt or trophy ever could. Never let anyone tell you that sacrifice for what you love is weakness, because it's the strongest thing a person can do." Years later, when people asked Marcus Blackwell about the moment that changed his life, he always told the story of the waitress who taught him to see, the champion who'd given up everything for love, and then used her strength, not for revenge, but for teaching. And he always ended the same way. She could have destroyed me, humiliated me, hurt me badly, but instead she showed me mercy and gave me truth. And that's the difference between power and strength. Power is what you can do to others. Strength is what you choose to do for others. And I spent 35 years confusing the two until a woman I'd disrespected showed me the difference with grace I didn't deserve. The moral of Maya's story spread far beyond that gym, beyond that city, carried by everyone who heard it and recognized themselves in either the champion who stayed silent or the privileged who stayed blind. That every person you meet is fighting battles you cannot see, carrying stories you haven't heard, holding dignity that your acknowledgement doesn't create, but your disrespect can wound. That true strength isn't dominating others, but lifting them. That transformation requires the humility to see yourself clearly and the courage to change what you see. That the choices we make in our hardest moments define us more than our easiest victories. And that sometimes the greatest fights aren't won by knockout, but by the mercy that teaches, the grace that transforms, and the love that sacrifices everything and calls it privilege because, in the end, we're all in the ring together, and the question isn't whether you can win, but whether you fight for something worth the cost, and whether you're strong enough not just to throw punches, but to pull them, not just to defeat your opponent, but to help them become better. Not just to claim victory, but to share it with everyone who helped you stand.